Good morning. See, I'm chopping the top of my head off there. Let's see if I can fix that. Yeah, that's a little better. Hope that your morning is off to a good start. Mine is so far. The second cup of the magic elixir. So I hope that your morning is off to a good start. And like we've been doing the last several weeks, I'm going to reflect for a few minutes this morning on one of the means of grace. And the means of grace, to remind you, are simply those things that we can do that can enable us to experience the grace of God. Those things that we can do that, to put it another way, strengthen our faith and draw us closer to God. And so to begin with, I guess it was 6 weeks ago, I talked for 2 weeks about communion. The Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, whatever you want to call it. It's all the same thing. 2 weeks on that, which is certainly the most important, I think, the means of grace. And then from there, we moved into the Scriptures, searching the Scriptures, how we read our Bibles, and then prayer. And then last week we were on fasting, and today we'll look at what John Wesley called Christian conferencing. Christian conferencing, and that term might be a little confusing for you. So the root of it is this: we need other people. We need other people. In order to be a good Christian, we need other Christians around us. I've heard so many people through the years that will either live this out or say it, and it's something to this effect. They just never go to church. They just never go to church, and they stay home, and they might watch somebody on TV, but they never go to church. The church is, and then why don't you go to church? Well, it's too full of hypocrites. Or I never found a church that I liked. Or, well, the church there, I don't like the music, or I don't like the preacher, or I don't like this, or I don't like that. And they never find a church that's good enough for them. And that is a tragic thing. It is a tragic thing to be somebody you never go to worship because you never find a church that's worthy of you being there. That's sad. That is sad. And the thing is that we can't be a good Christian all by ourselves. And as I've been around the block more and more, I'm more and more convinced of that it is impossible to be a good Christian all by yourself. That's in part why it's important that we look after our shut-ins, that people who are active in a church stop by and check in on the people who physically are unable to get there. We need each other. It is impossible to be a good Christian without being around good Christians. You cannot do it. The Christian life was not meant to be lived all alone. That's not the plan. The plan is for the Christian life to be lived in community with each other. John Wesley had this as a quote. This solitary religion is not to be found there. Holy solitaries is no more to be found than holy adulterers. The gospel of Christ knows of no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness. Some people, they focus on the last part of that, no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness. and they think that that is referring to social justice, which is good. But Wesley's not talking about that. You know, the whole quote, he's talking about living our life with other people. And he's talking about holy solitaries isn't found in the gospel. Somebody who is holy and solitary isn't found in the gospel. And he likened that to a holy adulterer, and that animal doesn't exist either. And so John Wesley consistently referred to what he called Christian conferencing as a means of grace. So we've looked at communion and searching the scriptures and prayer and fasting last week, and today Christian conferencing. Now, we Methodists love our conferences. We love our conferences. In my little corner of the kingdom, we've got our annual charge conference that's coming up in about 3.5 weeks. And then we have annual conference that happens every June. And then there are jurisdictional conferences every 4 years and a general conference every 4 years. And once in a while, once every third blue moon, there's an animal called a district conference. I've been to a couple of them in my career. So we love our conferences, but all of these conferences, the charge conference and annual conference and jurisdictional conference and general conference, these aren't what Wesley's talking about when he refers to Christian conferencing as a means of grace. What he's referring to in Christian conferencing is what really was the secret sauce for the Wesleyan movement, the Methodist movement in the 1700s. And that secret sauce was small groups. It was putting believers together into small groups for them to look after themselves and nurture each other. And that was the secret sauce. John Wesley, by any reckoning, was a great preacher. He is deservedly regarded as one of the great preachers of his era, but he wasn't the best. Yes, I'm a Methodist, always have been, probably always will be, but John Wesley wasn't the greatest preacher of the 1700s. The greatest was probably George Whitefield, who was sort of a frenemy of Wesley's. They were friends, but also theological. They also had their theological differences, which led to an interesting dynamic. But Whitefield, who was the greatest preacher of the 1700s, said this. He said that my brother Wesley acted wisely. The souls that were awakened under his ministry, he joined together into societies, and this preserved the fruit of his labor. This I neglected, and my people are a rope of sand. So the best preacher of the era recognized, probably too late, what Wesley had done and what he had failed to do. Wesley was, before there was such a thing as church growth strategist, he mastered it. Or that if for a movement to really be a movement, you had to administer it. You had to gather people together for their own nurturement. And Whitefield, for all of his skill as a preacher, realized too late that he had neglected that. And so Wesley had what might seem like a rather complex system of what we would call small groups, of different kinds of meetings. And at the top, there were general societies, which was simply all the people in all just a large group of people gathered together, sometimes in somebody's house, but a lot of times there was too many to fit in a house, and so some societies built a specific building for them. The most famous was in Bristol, called the New Room, and that New Room, they had room in the main floor was where they gathered for worship, some preaching and singing, some prayer, and if there wasn't an appointed preacher there, they had a layperson read one of Wesley's sermons in that same floor, and they moved the chairs out of the way, and the same floor could be used for teaching underprivileged kids how to read, or passing out medicines to people that couldn't afford it, and that sort of stuff. So that's the general society, and that's pretty much anybody. And then there were the class meetings, and the class meeting was that was it. The class meeting was it for the Wesleyan movement. 8, 10, 12 people, mixed gender, and they looked after each other. Meeting every week. And the class meeting was analogous to a small group today. And the thing with the class meeting is they weren't, as we might say, they weren't doing life together. They didn't have movie theaters in the 1700s. They weren't going to their equivalent movies together or gathering for social events together. It wasn't even so much a formal Bible study, though certain scripture was involved, but rather they were looking after each other's souls. It was in depth. How have you been tempted this week? How have you overcome that temptation? When did you find yourself in sin this week? It's that sort of stuff. It's not just doing life together. It wasn't going to social outings together. It was in depth. And it was, caring for each other's souls, caring for each other's walk. And then there was another small group that was a little more select than a band, than a class meeting. This was a band meeting, which was smaller, say 5 or 6 people. 5 or 6 people, and they would be, they were of same gender and status. So in other words, 5 or 6 single men, 5 or 6 married women, 5 or 6 married men, etc. And some of the same purposes as the class meeting, but the band was you might say a little deeper. You might say that it was a little deeper. And this was it. And the class meeting and the band meetings where people gathered together and they were looking after each other. And it's important to know that they weren't doing social events together. The focus was looking after each other in here. When we encounter each other in small groups of people, we also encounter God there. When we encounter each other, when we gather in small groups, we encounter each other and we encounter God. And Jesus said, where 2 or more are gathered in my name, there I will be also. Ecclesiastes has this line that a cord of many strands is not easily broken. some, I don't know, 25 years ago, a lot of you really large, like mega churches, began going to small groups. They began developing small groups because what they realized was that for as many people as they had coming in the front door, they had almost as many going out the back door. They had always had enough sound and lights and pyrotechnics and whatnot to draw people in. But the attrition rate was dreadful, and so X comes in and almost as many go out the back door. And they began developing programs of small groups. And so if you go to most large churches today will have small groups. They might call them small groups or life groups or whatever, but essentially it is a small group meeting. Even some medium-sized churches will have a system of small groups. The preacher can be good, you can really like the music, but unless you get connected somehow, it is easy to fall through the cracks. You know, if you come into a church and you sit on the back row, the back pew, and you never really get connected with anybody, it is awfully easy to just filter away. Awfully easy to just slip through the cracks and be gone again. And this small group becomes for us, for the believer, your first line of defense when things start going south. This becomes your first line of defense when life happens, and life happens to all of us. That this becomes your first line of defense, whether it is something moral in nature or grief or crisis, whatever. The first people that you call when you've had a new baby born or a new grandchild born or whatever your celebration is, these are your people. As believers, we need each other. As believers, we need each other. And if you've got a small group, what might have been called a class meeting way back when, if every church had a small group, had a system of small groups or class meetings, how many marriages could have been saved? How many people who have started attending a church and then slipped out the back door could have stayed connected? And in this, I'm primarily talking about larger churches, medium-sized and larger churches. A small church, even a smaller church, can have small groups, but it's much more important for medium-sized and bigger churches. We Methodists sort of jettisoned the class meeting a century or more back. For better, for worse, really for worse, we jettisoned the class meeting over a century ago. We dropped it. And everybody else picked it up. And now we Methodists are struggling to play catch up in the game that we started 250 years ago. We started the small group. This was Wesley's baby, and he was the genius of it, organizing the small groups, different purposes for the small groups, and rules that they would operate by. This was his genius. And this was the secret sauce for the Methodist movement, and it is important. It is important. So, if you are, whatever church you may be going to, some of y'all attend my two little churches. Some of you attend other places. If you go to a medium-sized or a larger church, get connected with a small group. If your church doesn't have small groups, find something to get yourself connected in. Just attend short-term Bible studies. Find some way to get yourself connected with other people. Because the Christian life is not meant to be lived alone. It is not meant to be lived alone. It is a sad thing to see people who are perfectly capable of going to church, stay home, and they never go. For whatever reason, they just never go. You see, when you think about it, we are all created in God's image. We are all created in the image of God. And none of us are perfect. So when we gather with other believers, in each other, we can encounter God. The theologian of the 1930s in Germany, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, wrote a magnificent little book called Life Together. And he over and over harps on this, that in our Christian brother or sister, we can encounter God. Each of us is created in the image of God. In some way, there's the fingerprint of God on each of us. And each of us as believers have gifts that we can use for the betterment of each other. So we need each other. We need each other. So, find yourself some way to get connected. Make certain you're in worship on Sunday if you're able. And find some way to get yourself connected in Sunday school or in a Bible study. We need each other. So, Christian conferencing as a means of grace. Have a great Wednesday.